Good evening to you all, and welcome to the second of the Stained Glass Museum's April series of talks. I'm very pleased that you could all join us this evening. My name is Jasmine Allen, and I'm the director and curator of the Stained Glass Museum, which, as many of you will know, is a wonderful collection of stained glass, which is located in Ely Cathedral. We are currently still closed, but if the government roadmap is anything to go by, we hope to open on Tuesday, the 18th of May. So stay tuned on our website and social media to find out as we get closer to that date when you can come and see our wonderful windows again. So it is time to introduce our speaker this evening, and at this point I will ask Erica to turn her video on so that you can see her and also to unmute. Good evening, Erica.
Good evening.
And Erica is joining us, I think, from nearby Leicester, actually, in Leicestershire tonight. Erica completed an MA in local history from Leicester University 15 years ago and has developed a really keen interest in the history of Leicester and Leicestershire, which has in recent years extended to stained glass. She was recently a parish councillor of her village just outside Leicester, and she is a member of the Leicester Stained Glass Appreciation Society and a friend of the Stained Glass Museum. And you'll find out more about both of those organisations, I think, after Erica has spoken. We'll give a plug to the Leicester Stained Glass Appreciation Society and also the Friends of the Museum. And I'm really grateful to Erica for agreeing to give us this talk this evening, which she's going to speak to us about some medieval stained glass treasures known as Wygston's house glass, about 13 panels dating to the 15th century, which you can see on display at the Newarke Houses Museum in Leicester when it's open. And I know that Erica has conducted some very extensive research into these windows, so we're really privileged to hear this evening. So thank you, Erica. I will hand over to you, and hopefully the slides will move on for you.
Yes. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for your welcome. I do appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all about some delightful 15th century stained glass that can still be found in what was once the heart of medieval Leicester. Now, these stained glass panels I'm about to show you were removed from 18 High Cross Street, Leicester, around 1824, when the then owner, the Reverend Richard Stevens, removed them to his vicarage at Belgrave in Leicester, but he kept them in a box. On his death, the glass was bought for £17 by Thomas North, a Leicester historian, in the 1870s on behalf of the Leicestershire Archaeological and Historical Society, who then deposited them with the Leicester Museum Service in 1917, which probably explains the relatively intact nature of the glass. 18 High Cross Street was in the heart of medieval Leicester and was built around 1490, hence the initial dating of the glass panels. The building is still in existence, and the windows where the panels were originally installed are still to be seen, but are now filled with clear glass. This house, Wygston's house, is actually still owned by Leicester City Council, but is currently leased to a bar and restaurant and is still known as Wygston's house. Now, 13 of these glass panels, as Jasmine mentioned, can still be seen. But they are in the Newarke Houses Museum, which is part of the De Montfort University campus, but available for the public to go and look at. Now, fortunately for us, they were seen in situ by John Nichols, the Leicestershire historian, and Throsby, his illustrator, who drew them around the end of the 18th century. And these recognisable sketches are recorded in Nichols' History of Leicester and Leicestershire. Nichols, though, says there were 27 of them when he viewed them in situ. So I began to wonder what had happened to the remaining 14 panels. Who was the artist who had commissioned and paid for them? And what sort of property was 18 High Cross Street when it was first built at the end of the 15th century? So I'm going to take you on a quest to see if you agree with my conclusions. So what follows is a distillation of information and photos of all the available relevant material that I could locate. Now we have on the first slide, it's a panel of a saint and a roundel. Now the glass panels are relatively small. The roundels are 6.5 inches in diameter and the panels of the saints 9 by 4 inches. Around each of these are decorations that have been reglazed and repositioned many times. They largely consist of acanthus leaves, pomegranates, which are symbols of immortality, life and fertility. They were examined very closely in the 19th century when they came into the possession of the Leicestershire Archaeological and Historical Society. And it was observed at that time, and I quote, "The outline of the subjects is painted in a rich brown colour on the face of the glass, and the colour of the drapery and ornamental parts is a bright yellow laid on the back of the glass. In varied depth and in some cases a scrumbling of brown is thrown over it." Now, we now know that this yellow is probably silver stain, which is painted over white glass and then fired, producing the varied shades of yellow depending on the temperature of the kiln. The brown pigment could be sepia, which is a pigment obtained from cuttlefish. On some of the panels are triangles of blue or red painted glass, but these look to be of a much later origin. Now, as Nichols and Throsby were almost the last people to see the glass in its original setting, and record it, I am going to largely describe these panels in the order that they saw them. So the first panel is St. Margaret of Antioch, and she is on the left-hand side here. She's in the museum. She was very popular in the 15th century. She was a patron saint of religious learning, and women prayed to her in the agonies of childbirth. So it is tempting to think she may be depicted here because she protected the donor's wife during childbirth. Margaret pierces with her processional cross the dragon, which was sent to terrify her into giving up her faith. She wears the crown of martyrdom and the nimbus of a saint, and carries the book symbolic of her learning. And the next panel is, as you probably know anyway, is St. Christopher, and he is in the museum. Perhaps the most popular of all the medieval saints, the patron saint of travellers. St. Christopher was converted by a hermit and took on the onerous task of carrying travellers over a fast-flowing river as an atonement for his evil life. One night, when the water was very high, a child asked to be carried across. The child grew heavier and heavier. Fortunately, the river subsided. On the other side, St. Christopher planted his staff in the ground and it grew leaves. And as you might have guessed, the child was indeed Jesus. Now, the next slide shows it's St. Catherine of Alexandria. And she is she's depicted in two different formats. She's the patron saint of secular learning, depicted holding a book and wearing the crown of martyrdom. She was a princess, and the spiked wheel was the intended instrument of her death. However, she apparently touched the wheel, and as she did, it shattered. She was then beheaded by a sword instead, and a milk-like substance issued from her neck rather than blood. Now, I'm hoping you're still following my logic here, but I want to explain a bit more about St. Catherine. There is a chapel in St. Martin's, which is now the cathedral in Leicester, dedicated to her. And a medieval mural of her was found on the north wall of St. Catherine's Chapel in St. Martin's, but this appears to have been obliterated by 1847. So we only have an illustration out of a book here. There is a side entrance to this chapel, and it was used by pregnant women who came to pray to St. Catherine. The mural looked very similar to our glass panel. It was drawn in the early 15th century, so our artists may have been influenced by it and copied it. So St. Catherine has a strong connection to St. Martin's, as well as being one of our glass panels. the next one is the glass panel, which is St. George. And again, he's in the museum. He's about to kill the dragon with his sword, having pierced it with his lance. The dragon's tail ends with a second smaller head, which bites St. George's leg. Now, he was particularly popular in Leicester. He is dressed in the full armour of the late 15th century. Now, the Mayor of Leicester in pre-Reformation times had to ride the George, and we can only guess what that was. This was part of his duties. The George may well have been some kind of lifelike model of a horse and was kept in St. Martin's Cathedral, where the medieval Guild of St. George met. Scratched on this glass is the name of Richard Stevens, August the 4th, 1796. He was the then owner of 18 High Cross Street and the father of John Stevens, who I mentioned earlier. Now, the next group of panels include the life and the joys of Mary. They not only include Mary's life, but some aspects of the life of Jesus, her son. The emphasis, though, is definitely on Mary, who during the 15th century became popular with ordinary people. She was also venerated by the local guild of Corpus Christi, who supported 4 chantry priests, who served at the altar dedicated to Corpus Christi in St. Martin's. The guild met in the Guildhall, which is next to St. Martin's, and incidentally, these 2 buildings are just a short distance away from 18 High Cross Street, where the glass panels were originally put. By this date, the guild members and the town council were effectively one body, the same people, and they were in charge of running the town of Leicester and therefore powerful, rich and influential. So I'm going to look at, first of all, I'm going to make the Annunciation window a little bit bigger so you can see it more clearly. And this is to be found in the museum. This is the first recorded event in the life of Mary in the New Testament. Mary turns to the angel Gabriel, alerted, one presumes, by the rustling of his feathery wings, and he says to her, Ave Gratia plena Dominus tecum. Hail, Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. Mary replies, Ecce ancilla Domini. Behold the handmaiden of the Lord. It is normal for Mary to be shown on the right and the angel on the left of this scene. But here it is the opposite way round. Mary's kneeling at a prie-dieu and before her is a book, traditionally the book of Isaiah, where the birth of Jesus is prophesied. She has her hair flowing loose over her shoulders and braided around her forehead, and she wears a tight-fitting dress of ermine with 2 round brooches and a cloak, a dress typical of the late 15th century. Highly feathered angels were also customary at the time. Gabriel wears a crown and a cloak and holds a sceptre in his hands, an attribute of a herald. Between them is a lily, the symbol of purity and the symbol of the Virgin Mary herself. Now, do note the distinctive floor tiles, and I'll be coming back to that later. An angel, or more likely God the Father, is blowing the Holy Spirit in the form of a dove towards Mary. And at the bottom of here, this particular panel, there are these initials, which could either be WR or RW, and I'll leave you to decide which you think is the more dominant letter. Now, the next panel, I haven't been able to get a photograph of this because this is one of the ones that seems to have disappeared, but I have got 2 depictions, photographs out of a book. Now, have a look at this and don't be fooled by the bit it says at the bottom, the birth of Mary, because I'd like you to have a look yourselves and think what actually is being depicted here. This is the next one on Nichols' list, and there certainly is some dispute as to what's being shown. It could either be the birth of the Virgin Mary or the birth of Jesus. Nichols thinks it's the birth of Jesus. If so, it's Mary who's actually in the bed. There is a nimbus around her head. The women are wearing contemporary clothing of the 15th century, and the baby that has just been born is tightly wrapped and has been placed in an English-style cradle with 2 angels rocking it. And this is where I think the various glass panels that we're going to see from a social history perspective start to get interesting. The mother is being attended to by a lady with a headdress, and she's got this black headdress, and I will just hopefully make that a little bit bigger so you can see, excuse me, what I'm talking about. Now on her headdress, she has down one end, she has what has been described as a cinquefoil, which is a 5-leafed logo, which the town of Leicester have used since the 14th century and is still used extensively today. Now, this 15th century woman appears throughout these panels, and her attention is definitely being drawn to her. The introduction of the donor or the donor's family into the life of the Virgin Mary by means of this artistic representation is very typical of this period, and indeed later periods. There are also 2 women in the background who may be midwives. One has a bowl and a spoon, and they may be bringing food for the mother, or they may just simply be just servants. The furniture is 15th century. Note the close stool, which is that sort of thing that looks, it's got like half a circle on top of it. It's a slightly funny angle. This is often found apparently in a medieval bedroom, and it's believed to be a type of commode, possibly. So it's a very homely scene that we're being shown here. And again, this panel has the RW or WR at the bottom of it. Now, the next panel here is described by Nichols as being the wise men's offerings. And this is possibly the most complete panel containing a roundel. This panel was not acquired at the same time as the other glass when it was purchased from the Reverend Stephen's estate, but was recovered as an auction purchase by the Leicester Museum in 1919. Above is the Gloria in Excelsis, and below an almost typical nativity scene with everything thrown in it. There's a star, there's Mary and Joseph, baby Jesus, but possibly looking a little older than a newborn. Joseph is interestingly sitting on a close stool. There are animals and a background suggestive of a stable. However, the Magi depicted here as 3 kings, and they are visiting. So this could be a slightly later part of the nativity story, because which is then in the Gospels it tells us it's inside a house. So it could be inside a house or with furniture. Now, the accompanying 3 men playing medieval musical instruments. Now, one set of these instruments could be bagpipes, and there is a similar depiction in stained glass at the V&A. These men may well be shepherds, it seems very likely, and with the potential sheep down at the bottom. Now, these sheep are quite large. Leicester sheep are large, but I am inclined to think they are probably an ox and a donkey. The next panel is the presentation in the temple, and this is on display in the museum. The infant Jesus is being brought to the priest by Mary, with a man, presumably Joseph, carrying 2 birds, either pigeons or doves, for sacrifice. The mother is showing she is now fit to go back to worship in the synagogue or the temple, and obeying Old Testament tradition by bringing her sacrifice. 2 women are holding lighted candles in the background. This is also the medieval celebration of Candlemas and purification of the Virgin Mary, blending medieval symbolism with the biblical account. Mary is holding out the infant Jesus to a Jewish priest who is wearing the headdress of the high priest. He stands behind an altar, and over him is a fringe canopy. There are actually 2 pieces of blue glass above and below the roundel, but it's not that clear. And the next panel of glass is the resurrection scene. Jesus is stepping out of a tabletop or box tomb, showing the marks on his hands, side and feet. plus the crown of thorns. He wears a loincloth and a cloak held by a large square brooch. In his hand is a cross and banner, with his right hand raised in a blessing. The tabletop tomb is typical of the 15th century. The soldiers wear elaborate 15th century armour, and each carries a different type of weapon: a spear, a pike with a crossblade, a glaive, and a poleaxe or halberd. The soldiers are depicted as either sleeping, dazed, or possibly drunk, all slightly humorous. The panel includes a WR or an RW. Now, this is a photograph of the glass that's in storage, and it is the Ascension. The only bit of Jesus it shows are his footprints and the bottom of his cloak. It shows Mary and the 12 apostles, headed up by St. Peter, holding keys in his right hand. They all kneel and pray while Jesus ascends into heaven. There is a red triangle of glass at the bottom of the roundel. And again, this has the initials RW in the bottom half. I do have a query, though, regarding 12 apostles. I think there should really only be 11 here. Now, the next one, again, this glass panel is in the museum, and this is the Lord in glory. This window shows Jesus with the 5 wounds of the crucifixion visible. And he is depicted wearing the crown of thorns with a loose robe draped over his shoulders and surrounded by rays of glory, as he is now in heaven. Now, this is probably the one that's the least been well kept, I suppose. This is actually supposedly, oops, I don't know what that is. I'll try and make it a little bit clearer. This is actually a photograph of a photograph of a photograph, essentially. I have no idea. We don't know what's happened to this particular one. But it is, if you haven't, I mean, giving you a chance there to have a look to see if you can work out what part of the life of the Virgin Mary this is supposed to be. It's the Assumption of the Virgin Mary and was celebrated from the 5th or 6th century on the 15th of August and still is, I believe, in the Catholic faith. This is the Virgin Mary being sent up to heaven, sinless and still a virgin. She stands on a crescent moon, which you can see at the bottom there. Not that clear, but it is actually there. This is a symbol of virginity, and this depiction of the Virgin Mary was common from the middle of the 15th century onwards. The crescent moon symbolism comes from Artemis, goddess of the moon, and also chaste. Scratched into this panel are the words Samuel Walker glazed these windows for Mr. John Stevens, February the 14th, 1764. And Nichols also adds that when he saw this panel in situ, it was partly covered by a wall. Seems to have been divided into 2 halves, so probably it does explain the extreme damage which probably took place when it was removed, sort of 200 years ago, essentially. This next panel is it's the Coronation of the Virgin Mary and the Trinity, and it is in storage. The Holy Trinity is represented as 3 separate persons. God the Son is a young man in a cloak wearing a crown, of which the first band is thorns. He has wounds in his hands, feet, and side. God the Father is represented as an old man, but obscured by the leading. God the Holy Spirit is also an old man wearing a triple crown. Each one has one hand raised in blessing and the other placed on the crown, and they are placing on Mary's head. Mary is dressed in the same way as in the Annunciation. She's depicted as a young girl. And that does conclude the life and joys of Mary. The next group, the Seven Sacraments. These are the rituals of the medieval Roman Catholic faith in which the community took part. And the first one is the elevation of the host or the Eucharist, the Mass. This is in the museum. The priest stands before an altar and raises the bread up before him. An acolyte kneels before him holding a long taper. The two men and one woman are kneeling are the same as those depicted in later scenes, which we'll see more of later, which possibly could be a family grouping. So we are beginning to ask ourselves possibly now, who are the benefactors being depicted here? There is a woman wearing a black headdress which has a cinquefoil ermine on it for decoration, devoutly awaiting her turn. And I'll just see if I can show you that particular bit there, because that's it there. So that's her. Just going to see if I can turn I don't know whether you can see the writing at the top. I'm just going to see if I can get rid of that. Yes.
Yeah, that's it. Thanks, Erica.
Yeah. Now, the next one is this is holy matrimony or marriage, and it is again in storage. Makes it easier to take photographs if you haven't got if you've got a sort of flat background, really. Now, it appears to be the same woman with the cinquefoil ermine headdress as seen in other windows, and with a youngish man getting married. The woman's headdress probably indicates she has been married before and her husband has died. Normally, a maiden would wear her hair loose. The couple are holding hands. There are two young men next to the groom. The priest joins the hands of the bride and the groom. The bride wears a long gown with a belt reaching down to the ground, and a headdress reaches to her shoulders. Behind the bride stands two bridesmaids carrying handkerchiefs. The groom wears a robe with a hood thrown over his shoulders. Behind the priest stands two young men, one with a plume in his hat and the other smartly dressed in a short jacket and full-length hose, with sword and dagger, and holding the bridegroom's hat. Since the men are still wearing their hats and carrying their weapons, it's possible that this was the initial part of the ceremony which took place in the church porch. The next one is baptism, and this is in the museum. Baptism usually took place within a couple of days of the child being born at this time, just in case they died without the rituals of the church having been performed. The priest is immersing a rather cross-looking baby in a font. This way of baptizing was typical of the time, and I believe the Orthodox Church still does a full immersion of a naked baby. It was done 3 times, hence an annoyed baby. Behind is an acolyte holding a lighted taper and a container for holy oil and an open prayer book. Apparently the font here bears a resemblance to those in the churches of All Saints Leicester and Borough on the Hill in Leicestershire. Both fonts are 13th century. There is a woman wearing the 4-piece headdress with a cinquefoil on it, which you can see there. Sometimes it looks more like just the heraldic symbol for ermine, and sometimes it looks more like a 5-leaf cinquefoil. And it is similar in the other windows. Around the woman's waist is a pomander attached by a chain. One man is wearing a tunic with the long split sleeves of the period and has a sword, and is dressed like a dandy. He also appears in other windows. These could be the child's parents and a godfather, or perhaps all 3 people are godparents. This could easily be the donor's family again. And the detail of this panel is typical of the 15th century. This is confirmation in the museum. The scene possibly contains the same family as in other windows. There's a woman with a cinquefoil on her headdress, an older man with hair, 3 small children and 1 young man. This is also a bishop of the time period with a mitre and crook and 2 priests behind him. The woman appears to be breastfeeding, again another very homely scene. The bishop makes the sign of the cross with holy oil on the head of a bound-up child. Looks to be a child who is old enough to walk though. 2 chaplains stand behind the bishop. One has a container holding the holy oil of confirmation. Confirmation is taking place much earlier than would normally be done today, but is always done by a bishop as opposed to a priest in the baptism window. Now the next panel, again, this one's in storage. It's holy orders. The bishop is holding the hands of 3 deacons whom he is anointing with holy oil. Behind the bishop stand 2 acolytes, one holding the bishop's crozier. The hands of the deacons are tied to their necks, a ceremony symbolising being bound in the service of God. They will probably serve as priests. And scratched onto the glass are the words, February the 14th, 1764, Samuel Walker glazed these windows for Mr. John Stevens. Now, on the left here, we have the panel depicting penance or confession, whereabouts unknown. Looks like the same family, a young man, an old man, and a woman with cinquefoil on a headdress. The priest sits on a carved high-back chair with a veil over part of his eyes. The young man kneels before him while the priest rests his left hand on his head. The young man and woman hold rosaries. Confession was done in full view of others in the church, apparently. The private confessional box didn't come in till much later on, and this appears to be a very English depiction. On the right is a picture of the glass. Again, I say it's been taken out of a book because I don't know where the actual glass is, and this is extreme unction, an end-of-life ritual. The priest, with his hands held up in blessing, leans over the dying man and is anointing him with holy oil before giving him the Eucharist. He would have already heard his confession. The man wearing the nightcap lies in bed on a wooden platform which is raised off the ground. An acolyte stands behind the priest holding a chrismatory. This is the vessel containing holy oil and an open office book. In the foreground, the dying man's wife sits on a stool weeping beside the bed. Now, I'd just like to quickly focus in on the dying man's wife, because her tears, they've even gone to the trouble of doing her tears. Now, the next group are the what we call the acts of mercy. And here is a picture. The benefactor is dressed as a wealthy merchant. In all this next series of pictures, he's dressed as a wealthy merchant wearing a flat hat with a decoration that looks like it could have a cinquefoil ermine on it. Let me just see if I can zoom in on that. At the top here, not quite as clear as on the woman on this particular panel. Now, he is actually giving drink to the thirsty, and this is on display in the museum. He's pouring liquid from a jug into the cup of a poor man, whilst his servant holds 2 wooden pitchers, presumably also filled with liquid, and he's rather unsmiling. Now, on the right, and I'll just focus in again on the relevant bit. For those of you who've been following this very closely, you'll realise you've already seen this particular panel. However, what you probably haven't seen is the fact that down the bottom here on the left-hand side is actually a bit that doesn't connect with the whole panel. And this is the feeding the hungry. And it's on the same panel that shows the Eucharist, which is the raising of the host, which is the bread. So there's a connection here, feeding the hungry. It's not terribly clear, but there are feet at the bottom, at the side there, of a man, and this is a basket of bread. And obviously the panel in its original state would have been far more detailed and on its own. Now, the next depiction here is sheltering the stranger. And again, it's a photo out of a book, because we don't know where that's gone to. The benefactor is inviting a barefooted elderly man into a house with a porch, and inside is another man comfortably in bed. This is clothing of the naked on the right side here. Same man dressed the same, semi-naked, poor man awaiting to be dressed. And if you find semi-naked poor men humorous, I think there's a little bit of humour intended in here. This is in storage. Visiting the sick. Same benefactor as before, who is giving the man coins. There are apparently coins in his hand, boots and crutch on the floor, and a close stool and a jug also in the room. The other one is burying the dead. Again, both of these are in storage. The corpse is wrapped in the shroud, marked on the breast with a cross, and is about to be lowered into the grave. The priest touches the body with the large processional cross, which he carries in his left hand. In the other hand, he has a small brush with which he is sprinkling holy water onto the body. Others in the scene include mourners, but no benefactor. Burial of the dead, as an act of mercy, comes from the Apocrypha, from the Book of Tobit. Graffiti on the panel says, Thomas Green new leaded these windows for Mr. Stevens in 1796. Now, I'm finishing up the actual bit about the panels with a group here that has seemed to have disappeared, but they are, so this is a photograph out of a museum guide. So these final panels are described by Nichols as the town crest and town arms. The borough arms, or the cinquefoil, which is this one here on the right, was originally the coat of arms of the Beaumont family, who were the first lords of Leicester Castle after the conquest. First seen connected with the borough of Leicester on a seal in 1343 and still used today. The Borough Crest is the wyvern, a mythological beast with a curling serpentine tail and dragon wings. It has webbed feet and is carrying another smaller beast in its mouth, either its young or its food. And the antelope at the bottom here was in the box with the panels when Thomas North acquired it back in the 19th century, but he dismisses it as being no importance. Nichols doesn't even mention it in his description. However, some of the later historians think it does belong with the glass panels, which is why I've mentioned it here. Now, those are all the panels that Nichols and Throsby saw. Some are displayed and some are in storage. Others appear to be missing. But what can we conclude from looking at them? Well, there's certainly a charming set of domestic glass of a friendly but very devout medieval family with connections. Nichols was of the opinion that the initials RW or WR, as he saw them, seeing that that particular way round, which have been inscribed on several of the panels, were those of the artist, but could offer no suggestion who that was. This probably is unlikely, as many stained glass artists at this time did not mark their glass, and often glass of this type was made in a workshop. However, I do have some suggestions. The house at 18 High Cross Street was believed to be constructed around 1490, and in 1497 a glazier called John Malin was a freeman of Leicester. He was also an attendee of St Martin's Church and would have known members of the town council and members of the Guild of Corpus Christi. It is likely that anyone wishing to commission glass of this sort may well have called on him first. The glass that can be seen here on the left-hand side is from the Mayor's Parlour from the Guildhall, which was the town hall at the time. And you can also see St Martin's Cathedral in the background there as well. And this glass was commissioned around the same time as well. Certainly it was in situ by 1485, and that's my only Richard III reference. It is likely to have been in situ, and although far from being complete, some of the decoration looks exactly the same and is likely to be the work of the same glassmaker. If you have a look, I've got St George here, and if you have a look, you can see the acanthus leaves, you can see the pomegranates. It is, I would say, pretty much certain to be the same glass artist. So it could be this John Malin. Another way of trying to work out who the glass could have been made by is looking at it more closely, viewing the portraits and the backgrounds to see if there are any similarities between our artists and other known workshops known to be active at the same period, but possibly in a different location. As you can imagine, I've trawled the internet and I only actually came up with one possibility, but definitely more work is required here. It was surprising to me to find that medieval glass was actually very different if you compare one with another. I think I was expecting a lot of similarities, but this was the only one that I thought vaguely fitted the bill. And this is from the workshop of Thomas Woodshaw and Richard Twigg. And here I am comparing the visitation glass found in Great Malvern Priory by Twigg and Woodshaw, and that's on the left here, with St. Catherine from our set of panels. And what I'd like you to do is look at, and I'll just focus in on probably this bit over here. If you look at the elongated fingers of Mary, and then if you look at the elongated fingers on the one at the Great Malvern Priory, if you also look at the bottom here of the tiling and the tiling on some of our panels, look at the facial features, I think you probably think there might possibly be a bit of similarity. But I do realise I definitely need to do more work on that. So, who was the glass made for? The initials RW or WR could relate to the donor, and at this period in time there were two mayors of Leicester who might well have been wealthy enough to have paid for the glass. One was a man called William Rowlett and the other was Roger Wygston. The latter was favoured by Thomas North, the Victorian Leicester historian, who first presented a discourse on the glass to his History Society. Roger Wygston was mayor 3 times. He was likely to have had property in this part of Leicester, and he was one of the 12 watchmen for Leicester, and he was responsible for the area around High Cross Street. He died in 1507, so he does fit the timeline quite nicely. The glass that we have seen depicts a man and a woman who appear to have connections with the town council, principally from the design of their headgear. But also, there are 2 pieces of glass that show the town crest and the town arms dating from the same period, again showing a potential connection with the town council. But was it Roger Wygston's residence, or did it have some other function? Nichols was of the opinion that this was the Chantry House, the home of the 4 chantry priests who served at the Guild of Corpus Christi's altar in St Martin's, where Wygston was a member, and where Wygston was the master of the guild in 1500. Could the glass have commemorated that fact? Nichols says that he saw the certificate that was issued showing that it was owned by the guild when the property was sequestered by the Crown under the legislation of 1547, disbanding chantries. Also, in the early part of the 19th century, it was generally believed that this was the Chantry House, when it was described by Susanna Watts, Leicester's first town guide, and she described this in 1808, and she says, "In this street, in the house of Mr. Stevens, are the remains of a chantry house or chapel, established for the purpose of saying masses for the dead, once belonging to St. Martin's Church. They consist of a range of windows exhibiting curiously painted glass, a regular series of painted history." Disappointingly, none of our panels give any further evidence of a connection with the guild. No pictures of chalices, for instance, like those to be seen in the glass in the Guildhall. Right. However, the glass and its depictions faced inwards rather than outward, so that it seems to be reminding those on the inside rather than those on the outside who the worthy donors and benefactors were, and whose immortal souls the priest should be praying for. And this is a slide of Wygston's house as it is today, the bar and restaurant. these are the very same apertures, windows where these glass panels that we've been looking at would have fitted. There are 27 of them, although I do accept that it has been heavily restored, but hopefully correctly restored. And you can go there today. You could go and have a drink in their outdoor seating area, and then 5 minutes walk down the road is you can actually go and see the glass panels themselves. Now, before I take any questions, I would like just to mention the Leicester Stained Glass Appreciation Group that I belong to. We do meet twice a month normally. We have been Zooming at the moment, and when everything goes back to normal, we'll be going back to regular visits to churches and other buildings that house stained glass in our locality. So if anyone would like further information on how to join, please do make a note of our email address. But I'm sure if you haven't had a chance to do that, then I'm sure Jasmine will be able to forward that on to you. And it's just a nice little panel from my local parish church here, done by Veronica Wall. So that's me done, but I'm more than happy to try and answer any questions you have or interested in any observations that you might have on what I've been talking about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erica. That was a really amazing interpretation. You walked us through your whole research and theory, and I think all of us were mesmerised by that. So thank you. Exemplary research. And exemplary explanation. And I'm sure there's lots of questions. So if you have questions for Erica or comments, as she said, please do put them in the Q&A or the chat, and we can ask Erica. I'll kick off as I usually do, just to get you all warmed up. Really nice to see the external windows there, to see they're very narrow vertical lancets, which fits very nicely. Of course, you can see some of the panels when you've got the framing, that there is that suggestion of how they were originally framed, with the roundel and then this kind of, can't remember exactly what shape it is around this framing device, and then plain diamond quarries. Do you think that's correct?
I think that's more or less it. They have been a bit distorted, but essentially, yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
And how many windows are there on each side? I mean, you know how many panels there were originally. Have you been able to think about how they might have been installed in those windows?
Yeah, they're in a line actually. They're in a complete horizontal line, so you can actually go 1 to 27. And there they are, slightly different shapes. It all looks very authentic, but even over the time I've lived in Leicester, it's been restored at least twice, Wygston's house, so you're never entirely sure if it's entirely correct.
So that's it's one facade, is it, the glass?
It's one facade.
Yeah.
It faces Jubilee Square, and it's just one facade, and it's quite low down. It's the bottom layer. It's the 2-story building now, but it's the bottom layer that's got this clear glass.
Fantastic. A few people had some kind of observations. Jane, who's one of our team, noticed the ears looked very similar when you showed us the comparison panel, and I also thought that it's quite compelling argument there, although like you say, there's always more glass out there than one has in the books and on the internet to hand. David also noted, for the moon under Mary's feet, see Revelation 12:1, a woman clothed with the sun with the moon under her feet.
Oh yeah, I like that. I like the biblical reference.
I can get that to you as well, Erica. That's Revelation 12:1. Someone asked if you could clarify that piece of furniture. I think you did say it looked like a commode. It appears in a few of the scenes. So yeah, a commode, and you do see that quite a bit in medieval glass. They're not uncommon. So do put any other questions in the Q&A. Otherwise, I'm going to just go to town here. Really fantastic that you pointed out to us something which I think would have perhaps taken some of us a while to notice, the same figures appearing throughout in the scenes. And you talked about the woman with the headdress and the kind of flower, the cinquefoil, as you called it, on her headdress, and then also the man wearing the black hat. So are you quite convinced then that could be the mayor and his wife? And is it Wygston who you would put your money on as being the person, the mayor, rather than the other mayor that you mentioned?
It could be. There's strong evidence to suggest that. There has been an article written in the 1970s by a Canadian academic, which was published in the Leicestershire Archaeological and Historical Society documents, which is all online. And she was absolutely convinced she knew exactly which members of the Wygston family were talking about, but unfortunately didn't really give any really good references that you could chase up. I certainly think it's certainly tradition, very much so in Leicester. This is Roger Wygston's house. He was the uncle of the more famous, or least famous in Leicester, William Wygston, who was a wool merchant. And yeah, you can almost trace the ownership of this house back. But disappointingly, we've only got Nichols's reference to say that it was a chantry house and he saw the certificate. It's actually there. I think that the information is actually in the records office, in the Leicester Records Office, to say that they know exactly who the ownership was from 1557, but that doesn't really help us as far as we're concerned for the glass.
And do we know Wygston's wife's name?
Well, in this article I read, she was called Modi, but that's all I know. I don't know any more. I can't find anything out. In the borough records, which are very extensive for Leicester, there seems to be no reference to her. But again, all these things I think are definitely works in progress, and it just keeps you interested, doesn't it? Knowing the bits you don't know.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out, because these are silver stained roundels, I think the way that they've demarcated the main man and woman is quite subtle. It's just using the pigment, the paint, to colour it kind of a black colour. But it's worth pointing out as well, isn't it, that in lots of medieval glassware we know that the donor, or we think it is the donor. So for example, All Saints Church in York has the Acts of Mercy window where the Mayor Nicholas Blackburn appears in each of the windows wearing the same outfit, and it's a coloured hat that particularly makes him stand out, so that we know that that's what they were doing. I wonder if you might go back to the burial one.
Yes.
Because I think, and I may have misheard this, so you have to correct me, Erica. You said you didn't think the patron the donor was in that window, but I thought he was without a hat.
Yes. I can't remember the logic behind it. A lot of the information I've got, I'm using Thomas North as a basis, and I suppose I'm just trusting that he was correct when he said he didn't think that the donor was in there.
Well, I think, as you pointed out, there was lots of things that he got wrong. Can you go back to the picture and we can have a look?
Yeah, let me just find that.
Well, I think you were very diplomatic and generous in your acknowledging their thoughts and theories, but also I think you very successfully busted some of them.
Yeah, I think, I can't just remember where it is, to be honest. No.
Yeah, there we go, that one.
Is that one there? Yeah.
Yeah, so on the right-hand side, is that not him?
Yes, I know.
On the right-hand side, because he's got the same collar and black underlayer, but he's just not wearing the hat.
Well, I suppose that would be in respect, wouldn't it? That's respect to the dead. You're right.
He's carrying prayer beads, which again is perhaps
he is, isn't he? Yeah, no, I will change that. He's most definitely the same guy who's visiting the sick, isn't he? Yeah, same hair. It's him.
Well, I'm convinced. I'm trying to convince.
Oh, definitely. Yes. Yeah, it did seem odd that he wasn't in there. Yeah.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions now, which is good because you're getting bored of my questions. David has asked, what do you make of the 1764 inscriptions? Simply repairs, or could it be when they were inserted? And asking if the window
question,
shape is reasonably characteristic of the 15th century as well.
I believe it is. I believe there's been several Leicester historians who have written about this. None of their works are actually in print. They tend to be museum guides that you just pick up. They're all convinced that it's 15th century, apart from one chap who thought it was early 16th century. But it didn't kind of fit the rest of the argument if you start saying it's early 16th century, really. But again, it's all open to speculation. Yeah, no, I mean the actual panels, I've tried measuring them with my phone if it makes sure they look like they might actually fit the ones that are on display, certainly in the museum. Yeah, I mean, to me, it all adds up, but you know, who knows?
Well, they certainly stylistically are kind of bang on for 15th century English. Absolutely, I think.
I'm glad you said that.
A couple of people have asked about restoration, and I noticed that some of them have suffered quite bad paint loss, where the black pigment has gone, and you can just see the kind of faint lines where there was pigment before. Do we know whether there's been any overpainting, that kind of restoration work, and do you know anything about the restoration?
The glass looks very, very similar to what Nichols' mate Throsby drew in his book. They look so similar, including the depictions of some of the actual restorations, that I don't think they've been touched for 200 years, essentially. I think I talked to the lady who is the keeper of things in storage for Leicester museums. They seem to have got rid of their curators, so I don't know where all the curators have gone to. So she was the only one who could give me any information at all, and she had very little idea. I simply hope she's not actually listening this evening. But I mean, it's not her fault. She's got the whole huge range of stuff to look at and keep safe. So it's a shame on Leicester that they don't respect this glass. I mean, what is actually displayed is displayed well, but the stuff in storage is it's a pity it's in storage, really.
Yeah, and I'm sure that is the case for a lot of local museums, actually. Certainly in my experience, that there's often quite a bit in store that they don't always know what to do with, because it's not the kind of focus of their collection. There's some real treasures in municipal museums, actually, for stained glass, and it's really, really fantastic for you to share these with us, and because the detail is really quite something, and to have someone explain the iconography and point out things that I think we may not have seen otherwise has been really quite exciting. So thank you, Erica, especially for those of us who haven't been able to go out and get up close to glass for some time.
Yeah,
and it took me a while to see the flower on the female donor. You know, it took a couple of looks on your slides to actually see it, so it's very, very subtle, but once you've seen it, then you can't unsee it.
No, that's right, you focus in on that, and I'm sure that's what you meant to do. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I will probably take the rest of my questions to Erica when I next see her, and we can continue the debate. So I don't think any more have popped in the Q&A. David has actually, David Critchley has suggested that sent a picture of a painting, which I'll make sure that I send to Erica so she gets all of those things you've put in the chat. So I'll make sure Erica gets that. And it's really fantastic of you to share this research with us, Erica, and really exciting. So thank you, and good luck in your continuing the quest to kind of really nail it, because I think you're almost there, and I hope that you might write it up, because I think it would be fantastic if you did.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I shall consider doing that. Yeah.
So thank you very much on behalf of all of us to Erica. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen to show you all what we've got coming up. Just a reminder that as well as joining the Leicester Stained Glass Appreciation Society, you could also become the friend of the Stained Glass Museum if you're not already. Do get in touch with us if you're interested in either of those groups, or both actually, because I'll make sure you get the right information. And next week, if you're all around, we're doing the final talk of this month and this spring. My colleague Emily and I will tell you a bit more about some of the stained glass in our collection, focusing particularly on the architectural context of the windows. So what happened to the buildings that these windows came from, and telling you a bit more about those stories, because so often they're seen in isolation in the gallery. So please join us next Wednesday evening at the same time, 7 p.m. If you haven't already got a ticket, you can get one via Art Tickets. The link is on that slide and also on our website. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you again to Erica. Hope to see you all again soon. Take care. Good night.